Thank you very much, Paul. And let me say right at the beginning, I'm not a diet expert and I'm not going to talk about diet unless we come to that in the discussions. If I'm an expert in anything relevant, it's in energy, metabolism, and energy balance. And that's what I'm really going to talk about. I just want to take you back a bit to get into this. In the days of COVID, there was a time when we could go into the open air and exercise with a small number of people. And I would go jogging with a couple of my friends. Whoops, this isn't advancing. Oh, John, can you? Yeah, no,
Is it advancing on your screen or not?
No.
No. It usually does this.
Oh, okay.
So
I used the left. I was using up and down. Fine. So Alex and Bobby are my jogging friends, and you see they're a very different stature. You know, Alex is very big, muscly, and Bobby is absolutely tiny. We'd say petite. So because I'm interested in these things, I say to them, now, what do you eat before you go jogging? You know, and then when you come back, what do you eat? You know, and what do you eat through the day? So these are my questions. And one of them says, oh, I never eat before jogging. And when I get home, I might have a bit of porridge, you know, and then eventually I'll have an evening meal perhaps and go to bed. And the other says, oh, it's fruit and cereals before jogging. And then I have some toast and then a succession of meals, you know, throughout the day. And of course, you know, nothing surprising about that, except perhaps it is surprising because it's Bobby, the tiny one, who seems to eat all the time, and Alex, who never seems to eat anything. I'm just sure that sort of conversation is familiar to many of you. It just seems to challenge our senses. Slightly more on the academic front. I don't know if you've come across Robert Lustig. He's an American pediatrician and the author of several books about what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. And this is a video of his, which is an official University of California television video. The words at the bottom in black and white are taken, they're from his screen. I'm not making these up. This is what he's saying. So he introduces this concept that I guess we've all met, that we have to balance our calories in and our calories out. And if there's any difference between them, that would be reflected in a change in the body's energy stores and ultimately in our weight. And he says this is the basic concept of the first law of thermodynamics. If you eat it, you better burn it or you're going to store it. That's his words. And then he looks at his audience and says, now, who here believes that? And they sort of chuckle apprehensively because they know they're about to be challenged. And he says, I used to believe that. I think that is the biggest mistake. And that is the phenomenon I'm going to try to debunk. The frightening thing about this is that this video has been viewed more than 25 million times. Even more on the academic side, in 2021, this paper appeared in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is the flagship journal of the American Society for Nutrition. And its primary author is David Ludwig, who has written a lot on this topic. And it was described as a perspective article about his alternative to what I would call the energy balance model. And I'll just give you a brief extract from this paper. This is the words from the paper. According to a commonly held view, the obesity pandemic is caused by overconsumption of modern, highly palatable, energy-dense processed foods exacerbated by a sedentary lifestyle. Yeah, sure. However, obesity rates remain at historic highs despite a persistent focus on eating less and moving more, as guided by the energy balance model, as he calls it, EBM. This public health failure may arise from a fundamental limitation of the energy balance model itself. Well, I just find that frightening. And this was actually, the appearance of this paper was the stimulus for me to start writing what I did. And this is the book that resulted. Sorry about the green and red on the top, which are going to obscure some subtitles, but I'll read them out if they're important. And this book came out at the beginning of the year. It was noticed by Paul, who contacted me and said, would you like to come and talk to us about it? Which, of course, I was very pleased to do. What I'm going to do is give you a fairly light-hearted and partly anecdotal talk. I'm not going to get into deep science, although there are some aspects of the science that are really, really important, and I will try to stress, and they're perhaps not what you expect. So I'm going to talk about a number of topics, some of them quite briefly. And I want to begin with this vexed topic of my metabolism is too slow. Now, those of you who are doctors, you tell people in a social setting, I'm a doctor, and I know what they'll say to you. Oh, I've got this pain in my whatever. You know, when I tell them I'm a professor of human metabolism, the one question that comes up is, can you tell me why mine is so slow? always, always. And this is such a widely believed phenomenon. A few years ago, a consortium in Cambridge did a study on the genetics of leanness. And actually, that wasn't terribly interesting. They found many of the same genes as are associated with overweight. But on their website appeared this statement. We already know that people can be thin for different reasons. Some people are just not that interested in food, okay, whereas others can eat what they like, but never put on weight. That's a pretty striking statement. And then I found on the Harvard Medical School website, everyone knows some people who can eat ice cream, cake, and whatever else they want and still not gain weight. At the other extreme are people who seem to gain weight no matter how little they eat. Why? What are the causes of obesity? This is very controversial stuff. So I thought, I'm an experimental scientist. If these differences in people's metabolism really exist, surely we can bring people into the lab and study what causes this. But that's not an original thought. And when I looked into this, there are a good solid 10, maybe a dozen studies of exactly this phenomenon in the literature. I'm going to show you one of these. This is by a group of very eminent people, some of whom I know in Australia. And it's about energy metabolism in free living, as we'll see in a moment, large eating and small eating women. I'll tell you what that means. Studies using 2H2-18O. And this 2H2-18O, if you haven't come across it, is what's always known as doubly labeled water. And it's very important to the story I'm going to tell. So the volunteers, it's a very simple experiment to do because the volunteers are simply given some water to drink. In that water, the normal hydrogen atoms have been substituted with deuterium, H2, and the oxygen atoms have been substituted with O18. They're both stable isotopes, no radioactive hazard. And then over the course of the next few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, obviously we lose water from the body, and the amount of deuterium in the body decreases steadily over 2 or 3 weeks, exponentially. The amount of oxygen 18 also decreases, but it decreases somewhat faster. And that's because the oxygen 18 is lost in water, but also it equilibrates with the body's carbon dioxide pool and it's lost as CO2. So the difference between the rate of loss from the body of those two isotopes gives us a measure of the rate at which that person is breathing out CO2. And that is just as good as measuring oxygen consumption for getting a measure of energy expenditure. And this is a wonderful method because people can go away out of the lab, live their normal lives. They're not being confined in a calorimeter as we used to do. And over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, we can measure their energy expenditure. It's just transformed our understanding, as you'll see. So they recruited people who were reporting exactly what we've just been looking at, people who were reporting eating something under 1,500 kilocalories a day, and a group who were eating almost double that amount. So this is absolutely what we want to find. These are people, obviously, with a very, very slow metabolism, really can't eat too much or they'll put on weight, and people with a very fast metabolism, so they can eat nearly 3,000 calories. And so they used the doubly labeled water method to measure their energy expenditure. And what they found was something that you might not have expected. So for the large eaters, inverted commas, those two are fairly well balanced. But when you look at the small eaters, their energy expenditure appears to be about twice their energy intake. Okay. And I hope you'll recognize immediately, this is not compatible with everyday life because these people are meant to be they were said to be in a state of weight stability. So there's something wrong here. And the question is, what is it that's wrong? The authors were very clear because actually this is the third study they'd done on this topic. They were very clear. So they brought in 2 of these small eaters into their clinical research unit so they could feed them exactly. They knew exactly what they're feeding them. And they fed them their self-reported energy intakes. And of course, they lost weight steadily over the next few weeks while they were being studied. So there's a problem here with the reported energy intakes. And as the author said, these results provide no support for the existence of metabolically efficient women in the community. What that means is slow metabolizers. And I've summarized a lot of these studies in the book that we were talking about. And this is my brief summary of that field of research. The ability to eat cream cakes and not gain weight, although a vivid impression in our minds, turns out to be a remarkably elusive phenomenon. And what I'm coming around to here is the issue of underreporting of energy intake, which has pervaded studies in this area for decades. Really skewed this area. I want to talk a little bit about Harry Keane. Can I ask, did anybody know Harry Keane? Yeah, are you a diabetes physician? No. Anyway, Harry was a very well-respected diabetes physician in London. He was my PhD examiner, and I had quite a lot to do with him throughout my career. Very nice man. And so I was interested when this paper appeared, in which, with John Jarrett, epidemiologist, they'd collated data from 3 cohort studies, one of them being the well-known Whitehall study of civil servants. And in all these studies, they'd got a measure of energy intake of the participants. And of course, they'd got data like body mass index, BMI. And they plotted reported energy intake, kilocalories per day, against BMI. And what they found was, of course, a lot of scatter. That's not surprising. But because of the large numbers here, a highly significant negative relationship. In other words, the bigger people were, the less they seemed to be eating. And because it was fashionable at the time, they took this at face value. And they said studies other than ours also report obese people eating less than controls. Dietary data, for instance, from the very large Framingham study near Boston also suggest very strongly that overweight subjects ate less than those who were underweight. In the obese, average energy intake and output, that is energy throughput, is lower than in the lean. They were, in other words, ascribing obesity to slow metabolism. And I'm really not trying to get at Harry Keane or his colleagues, because this was a common view of the time. And I'll just show you another paper from a similar period. This is Dan Kromhout, a Dutch epidemiologist, reporting on the Zutphen study, which started in 1960 as part of Ansel Keys' 7 countries study. And he says, obese individuals in affluent cultures have generally a lower energy intake than their lean counterparts. And what's more, he quotes 7 references to that effect. And he says the major implication of these results may be that in weight reduction programs and health strategies, more emphasis needs to be placed on increased physical activity than on reduced energy intake, because obese people are already eating less than their lean counterparts. And this view was really pervasive at that time. I'm going back a few decades. And what was going on here was just a failure to understand the difficulties of recording energy intake. And that really that difficulty began to be unblocked by a number of people in the late 1980s, early 1990s. This is a group reporting from the Dunn Clinical Nutrition Unit in Cambridge. And it was particularly the work of the second author here, Gail Goldberg, who at that time was a young nutritionist. And I knew her very well, working in this area. She died, unfortunately, as you see, very young. But they were becoming suspicious of energy intake data. And Gail Goldberg collated data from a number of studies, as you see, 37 published dietary studies. And then there were different methods of recording energy intake. So it provided 68 subgroups. And what she did was to, beg your pardon, I'll just go back a minute. She used what she called the fundamental principles of energy physiology to evaluate these results. So what she said was, they had data on weight, height, age, and sex of all participants. And from that, you can get a very good estimate of basal metabolic rate. And then for most people, daily energy expenditure is more than 1.5 times the basal metabolic rate extrapolated over the whole day. So they said anybody reporting less than that is really reporting something that's pretty well incompatible with life. And when they looked at all these subgroups, they found that according to the way in which energy intake had been recorded, up to 90% really of the results just weren't compatible with normal physiology. And this began to really unravel the business of looking at energy intake. 2 of those authors from that paper, Barbara Livingston and Alison Black, were later on working in the University of Ulster in Coleraine. And they carried out a much larger study of study of beg your pardon, papers in which energy intake and energy expenditure had both been measured. So they could really look at underreporting in a very objective way. And when I say even worse news, the worst news was that they found profound underreporting of energy intake in obese people, and that the probability of underreporting increases as BMI increases. Now, the reasons for that I'm not going to discuss. I mean, it's something we can talk about later. I think it's very fundamental to the obese state, probably. But it means that any attempt to understand obesity in terms of energy intake is going to fail. And of course, the only way we can really study that is to measure energy expenditure. So all this was very nicely highlighted in a paper, again, from the Energy Metabolism Group, as they call themselves, at the Dunn Clinical Nutrition Unit in Cambridge, this time led by Andrew Prentice, who then went on to become Professor of International Nutrition at London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine in the Gambia. They recruited women, lean and obese. So we're not judging this by energy intake, we're judging it by lean or obese. You see a BMI of the obese group of 33, so they don't look very obese, but actually if you look at the fat mass, and this is something I often have to point out, if you look at the measured fat mass of the obese women compared with the lean, it's something like 2.5 times, so that fat mass goes up a lot more than you would think from the BMI. I can talk more about that later. And they did the usual thing. They asked these women to record their energy intake, but this group were already aware of underreporting. So they were very thorough, and I'm just going to tell you how they did the energy intake measurements. Each subject recorded her food intake by weighing all foods and fluids over 7 days for the lean group and over 2 periods of 7 days for the obese group. You could hardly be more thorough than that. And they found the obese group were reporting less energy intake than the lean. But this was a double-labeled water study, so they had the energy expenditure. And what you see is in the lean group, they really got it right. I mean, there was an almost exact match between energy intake and energy expenditure. In the obese group, although energy intake appeared to be lower than in the lean group, energy expenditure was considerably greater. And this was not the first, but it was one of the first demonstrations that in obesity, energy expenditure is greater than in lean people. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is so. Why should energy expenditure be greater in obese people than lean? And what I'm going to show you is a way I've plotted the data, but I wasn't the person that pointed this out. In this Prentice paper, they gave all the individual data, and so I was able to plot these out. This appears in my textbook of metabolism that Paul mentioned. And what I've plotted here is metabolic rate. This is resting energy expenditure, or basal metabolic rate, expressed in megajoules per day, against the fat-free mass of the body, or the lean body mass. In other words, this is the mass of the body minus the weight of actual fat, because this is the active part of the body. And what you see is, firstly, that the obese, who are the solid circles in red, are mostly well to the right of the lean group. There's a tiny bit of overlap. In other words, they have greater fat-free mass than the lean, as well as much greater fat mass. And you see that metabolic rate is just very, very tightly, basal metabolic rate, very tightly related to fat-free mass. And because in obesity, what's accumulating is fat, but also fat-free mass to a lesser extent. That's why the energy expenditure in obesity is higher than in lean people. In the paper, they also gave, because of the double-labeled water, those basal metabolic rate measurements were made in a calorimeter. They had total metabolic rate, that's 24-hour energy expenditure. And of course, that's a lot more scattered because there's varying degrees of physical activity, but still the same things are true. The obese people have rather higher energy expenditure than the lean because of their rather higher fat-free mass. That's going to take me on to talk about the energetics of obesity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Reg Passmore, but I'm going to introduce him in more detail later. He was a very, very influential physiologist working in Edinburgh on problems of nutrition and obesity. And he put forward this idea. He said, imagine a healthy man or woman who either eats an extra half slice of bread 50 grams at breakfast, or takes his car to work instead of walking 10 minutes each way, and goes into a positive energy balance of just 50 kilocalories per day. There's another illustration that's attributed to Reg Passmore that I've been told, but I can't find it in the literature, of two twins, one of whom begins to add an extra pat of butter each day to their toast, just one pat of butter. And then he says if there are no compensatory changes, he or she will store in 10 years an extra 20 grams of fat, of triglyceride, and be seriously obese. It is not necessary for a glutton to become obese. Now, I've got to say, I'm not getting at Reg Passmore because I used to teach the medical students. I hope I didn't teach you this, Paul. Exactly the same thing with a slightly different way of looking at it. The calculation is just very simple. 50 kilocalories a day, multiply that by 365 days in a year and 10 years, and you get 182,000 kilocalories. And if fat is 9 kilocalories per gram, as we always say, that's 20 kilograms. But it's wrong. And I didn't realize why it was wrong for a long time, but I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. If we go to, I'm sorry that the part of the title is getting obliterated, but I think you can see it, energetics of obesity. If we go back to the Prentice data, we've got energy expenditure here in lean women and obese women. And the difference is not 50 kilocalories per day. It's 10 times that. So this is not an extra pat of butter. This is an extra Big Mac a day. The significance of that, of course, is that if these people, the obese people, want to cut down their energy intake to become lean, they've got a lot of cutting down to do. And it's one of the difficulties of dealing with obesity. But why is it that that simple calculation doesn't work? And the answer is that the body does compensate. The body compensates. When energy intake falls, energy expenditure falls. When energy intake increases, energy expenditure increases. And this is a compensation. I'm not sure it's, I don't know how to put this, that it's something that's evolved as a compensation to stabilize the body weight, or is it just an inevitable consequence? Because as I show you, a lot of this follows from the change in fat-free mass of the body in these situations. I'll just illustrate each of these directions with one illustration. So energy expenditure falls when energy intake is restricted. That is, of course, one of the things that makes dieting so difficult. As soon as you restrict your energy intake, your energy expenditure falls, and you've got to go even lower and lower. A very nice illustration of this comes from the work done by the American nutritionist Ansel Keys during the Second World War. He recruited a group of conscientious objectors. Just underneath the picture there, you can't read it, it says, conscientious objectors volunteer for strict hunger tests to study Europe's food problem. So this was his attempt to look at what was happening to people in Europe. I mean, partly the UK with rationing, and of course later it became much more significant in the Netherlands, for instance, with the food restrictions there. So he recruited these men. He halved their energy intake for 24 weeks. The men, there's a lot of description of this. The men felt ravenously hungry. Some of them were excluded from the study because they'd clearly slipped out to get extra food. Well, I mean, who wouldn't really? But they were very detailed. This is written up in two thick volumes. Their weight dropped by 16 kilograms. Their resting energy expenditure fell by about 40%. And Ansel Keys was conscious of the fact that that's partly because they'd lost lean body mass, but maybe there was something beyond that. So he actually tried to calculate this. He calculated relative energy expenditure, resting energy expenditure, relative to what he called active tissue mass, which is pretty near what we'd call lean body mass. And that fell by 16%. In other words, there's a component beyond that. I think, and I'm not going to show you the evidence for this because I've put this together from a number of sources. I think the component beyond that is probably a short-term thing. And I think once the weight stabilizes at a lower level, then the resting energy expenditure will reflect the change in lean body mass. But I think there is also an acute effect beyond that. And for the endocrinologists, quite a bit of this is understood through the action of leptin on thyroid hormone secretion. I'll show you what happens the other way. And this is usually shown in what people call overfeeding experiments. In other words, volunteers are given more than they need. And there are a lot of these studies in the literature, and they have slightly differing conclusions. But this is, I think, one of the latest and probably most comprehensive studies. It's from Eric Ravizan, who is, I was going to say more about him earlier and I forgot. But anyway, he's an eminent obesity researcher working at the Pennington Biomedical Research Centre in Baton Rouge. He was actually Swiss originally and was one of the first people to show elevated energy expenditure in obesity. So they recruited volunteers. They measured their energy expenditure very carefully with doubly labeled water. And they then gave them 40% more than that over 8 weeks. And it was a laboratory study, so there was no doubt what these people were eating. They increased their weight. I haven't put this on. They gained about 7.5 kilograms of weight, about 10% of their initial weight over that period, of which more than half was fat. And this is the energy expenditure measured with double labeled water. And you see it's increased quite a bit. The y-axis doesn't go down to 0, so don't be fooled by this. That's because I'm not good enough in Excel to put little breaks in the y-axis. But anyway, there was an increase in energy expenditure. And most of this, they said, was attributable to the gain in body mass. They didn't find any evidence for anything beyond that. Some studies do, and this is the phenomenon that's been called by various names, but originally it was called luxus consumption. And it's been shown very clearly in rats. Rats will increase their energy expenditure a lot more than you'd expect by activating brown fat. That really has not been shown in man. So there are these changes, mainly reflecting changes in lean body mass. I'm going to go on and talk about regulation of body weight. It could be a very big topic. There are people who've studied this in much more detail than I have. I'm just going to give you some pointers to what I think is going on. And this becomes very personal, very anecdotal now. So it so happens that, I know what I weighed when I was a student and I know what I weigh now, and it's not very different, half a kilogram or so. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who could say something similar, maybe a bit less precise than that, maybe not. And if I work out the precision with which I've balanced energy intake and expenditure over the years since I was a student, which is like almost 60 years, it comes to about 0.05 of a kilocalorie per meal. In other words, I've been balancing my energy intake and expenditure to about 0.2% of 1p per meal. So, and lots of people have done this calculation and said, well, how can you possibly do that? I mean, obviously I can't. And so there's got to be something internal that's bringing about this regulation. Well, I'm going to talk about the internal mechanisms, and then I'm probably going to dismiss them. We'll talk about that. And this is a very, very interesting story, which I'll tell you briefly now, but it's all explained in the book, The Calorie is a Calorie book. And it begins with the birth of conjoined twins to a Bohemian farming couple in the 19th century. And these twins were called Rosa and Josefa Lajek twins. The story of their birth is fascinating. I'll just read you this quickly. It was a vaginal delivery. The father was witnessing it, and he witnessed the vertex of Rosa presenting routinely, suddenly followed by 2 pairs of fully developed legs. And in 5 minutes, it was all over. And there they were. Anyway, they were joined, as you see, around the hip, and they shared some of the anatomy in the pelvic region, but otherwise they were independent. And they lived a conjoint life. They could walk. One of them walked forwards, the other walked backwards, or they could walk sideways. They became, not surprisingly, known as, what then would have been called freaks, and they were exhibited. And they went along with this because it was a source of income, and the parents benefited from it. They had a manager. The interesting part of the story is that when they were 32, Rosa became pregnant. And it's not known who the father was, but the suspicion is it was their manager. And then the really interesting part of the story is that when Rosa breastfed her baby, Josefa lactated. And this is clearly because they shared to some extent their circulation. And so a hormone, presumably oxytocin, produced by Rosa was affecting Josefa. Now, what's that got to do with energy balance? Not a lot directly, but this case was quoted by the physiologist then working in Cambridge, Romain Hervey, G.R. Hervey, who was working on rats, and he was working on a rat model of obesity, which is a rat in which you make a lesion in the ventromedial hypothalamus, and that causes the rat to become obese. And he thought, I'll have a look at whether there's a hormone involved in this. So he conjoined rats. The technique is called parabiosis, and you simply stitch. You open the abdominal cavity, and you open the skin around the abdomen, and you just stitch two rats together, and then they share a small amount of their circulation. I'm not a rat experimenter, so I'm not a rat either. So I can't quite imagine this. But anyway, there are pictures of these, and then he found some interesting things. By doing this conjoined experiment with rats. And he put forward the idea that there was a hormone involved, sending a signal about how much fat the body was storing. That was picked up later by Doug Coleman, an American physiologist who was working at the Jackson lab in Bar Harbor, Maine, where they were studying the obob mouse. And the obob mouse is a mouse which is homozygous for a single gene mutation. That much was known. It's called obob because it's homozygous for a gene that they called OB for obese. Although normally this gene makes you lean, and these mice, as it turned out, have a mutation in that gene. And Doug Coleman paired these in various ways and came up with a very convincing story that there's a hormone that's signaling the body's fat stores and telling the animal to stop eating. And that led then, not so much later, in 1995 to the discovery of the hormone leptin, a hormone, peptide hormone, secreted by white fat cells and effectively telling the brain the state of the fat stores and signaling to reduce appetite when there's too much or increase appetite when there's too little. And this has led to an enormous field of research and groups all over the world, but particularly a group in Cambridge working a lot on the hypothalamic mechanisms by which this signals. And some of the terminology here will be familiar to you because GLP-1 there figures, and that of course is the basis for the drugs that are now called the weight loss drugs. So there is this complicated mechanism by which the body can maintain some sort of weight homeostasis. You'll see at the bottom a description of it regulating feeding and metabolic rate. The metabolic rate is, I need to say this, is something you see in rodents, but not in humans, and we shouldn't think that. As far as can be told, all these mechanisms are really regulating appetite and not energy expenditure. So this is all fine. And there's no doubt this operates because if people have a mutation in one of these genes, there's a small number of people with homozygous for mutations in the leptin gene who have enormous eating problems. And the same for some of these other components. But I don't want us to think that that's how I've achieved my weight stability or any of you who are in the same position. I don't think it can be, because I just want to say, don't forget the obvious. And I want to talk now about somebody else who has an influence on my career, and that's John Garrow. Does anybody know John Garrow? John Garrow was a physician with a great interest in obesity, working in London. When I knew him, he was working at the MRC's Clinical Research Centre at Northwick Park. He treated obese patients, but he also did research and wrote a very, very important textbook called Energy Balance and Obesity in Man, which in some ways was a technical version of what I've now written. And here we are enjoying a meal together in 1991. I've got some nice correspondence from John Garrow, and he wrote to me about Reg Passmore, of whom I talked earlier. Reg Passmore, as I said, was a physiologist studying obesity, and he was an author of this classic textbook, Human Nutrition and Dietetics. In that book, John Garrow pointed this out to me. Passmore said, 40 years ago, as an undergraduate, RP, presumably that's Reg Passmore, had a tailcoat made for him. He still wears the coat occasionally and it still fits. His weight has never varied by more than 5 pounds. Fine. That's the sort of thing many of us could say. Garrow writes to me, I beg your pardon. Garrow writes to me, Passmore believed this to indicate that food intake had a regulatory mechanism of great precision. And many people now would immediately assume that's the leptin mechanism that I've just been talking about. But Garrow, who was very provocative, he was outspoken, said, I thought this was nonsense. And what he said was, it seemed much more probable that the tailcoat was the regulatory mechanism of great precision. If he found that it did not fit, he was, being a Scot like myself, much more likely to adjust his food intake by new current. And I just think this is such a grain of common sense. You know, I don't believe I've maintained my weight, and many of you who've done the same thing, because of some little signal telling my brain, oh, a bit too much fat, bit too little fat, do something. I think it's because, you know, I weigh myself on the bathroom scales, my trousers get too tight, whatever, and I adjust my food intake. Just think it's so obvious within an individual. Now, differences between individuals, maybe those mechanisms are much more relevant, but within an individual, I just think this is common sense. That's how we know, you know, what's happening to our weight. I'm slightly related to that. I'm just going quite briefly now to talk about the idea of a set point. And I'm going to use John Garrow for this again in a moment. But this idea that we have a set point for body weight is quite entrenched in some of the popular literature. So this is Jason Fung in a widely read book. The set point for weight is vigorously defended. Oh, great. You know, like blood glucose, you know, should be 5 millimoles per litre. And then it's vigorously defended. The problem in obesity is that the set point is too high. Wow. You know, so if we could understand this set point, might be able to do something about obesity. Well, John Garrow, of whom I've talked quite a bit now, had a similar feeling because he, a bit like me, found his weight was very steady. And his weight was running along at about 75, 76 kilograms. And it had been for many years. And he says he believed this was his natural weight or settled weight. So he decided to test this. And he did it by restricting his food intake. And he lost about 7 kilograms. Incidentally, he says how hard that was and how that influenced his treatment of obese people, just realizing how hard it is actually to cut down. Anyway, he did that. So he lost about 7 kilograms. What he did then, after that period of weight loss, was he stopped weighing himself, but he got somebody else to weigh him and not tell him the answer. And what happened was, as you see over the next 4 or 5 months, his weight drifted back up to 75, 76 kilograms. Great, you know, set point. But it didn't stop. It went on up. And as he himself says, after some months, he became aware his trousers were just too tight. And he says, as he says, the experiment was now unblinded because he was aware of the result. And then he cut down again and went back to the weight that he liked to be, 75, 76 kilograms. And this destroyed his belief in a set point. And I must say, I cannot really find evidence in the literature that supports the idea of a set point. So I think that's another myth I'd like to get rid of. So I've shown you a lot of slides. Talked to you quite a lot. I just want to summarize some of the points that I think are really important. I think we often discuss our energy balance based on very shaky anecdotal evidence. You know, oh, I never eat, whatever, or I'm always eating, and all this. It's just anecdotal and really, really not a basis for assuming anything about energy balance. Records of energy intake just should not form the basis for anything other than perhaps qualitatively the sort of things people are eating, but not quantitative. I mean, we just don't have the technology. By the way, again, in the book, I've reviewed studies where people have tried to improve on this by getting the volunteers to take a photograph of their meals, you know, and it makes not a jot of difference. Still unreliable. But on the other hand, energy expenditure can be measured objectively, and that's what we should be looking at when we're discussing matters of energy balance. So my belief is that a calorie is still a calorie and nothing's really changed. And it does all come down to calories in and calories out. And with that, I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that presentation, which has certainly given me food for thought. And I think that I'm going to adopt the Scottish approach to weight regulation, do by clothes rather than diet. So thank you. I've got lots of questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I'm sure the audience will want to ask them. And maybe I'll find out why in middle age I find it so much harder to retain my student weight. So I was envious actually of the people on there who were the same weight, including yourself actually, plus or minus fraction of a p. Different. I thought I think I'm slightly heavier than I was in those days, and I wonder how people need to work harder in middle age, anyway, or even old age. Right, so questions from the audience. Phil, are you asking a question?
I was. I didn't want to.
But
So you mentioned velocity, but there's also the Gary Taubes has written a book which the title which is almost the exact opposite of yours, saying a calorie is not a calorie.
Yeah.
Have you debated with him?
Yeah, a lot. So the question is about Gary Taubes, an American science writer, not a scientist,
He was a physicist.
science journalist, he would call himself, who's written books, as you say, with titles very different from mine. He's written a lot about sugar, the case against sugar, and they're wonderfully readable books. You know, he's a very good writer. I just think he gets things wrong. And no, we've had I've spoken to him many times, and we've corresponded about my book, and he says, well, you just haven't understood what we're saying. Well, I've tried ever so hard to understand what they're saying, you know, so I just think we never will quite agree. But I do think, so the people who are contradicting the energy balance model that I just think we have to believe in, I think it's very interesting. They're mostly from North America, you know, and I just think the environment there is even more toxic, obesogenic than it is here, and that seems to me quite a relevant factor. So yes, I have talked to him, and we don't agree, but we don't agree amicably.
Okay. Thank you.
thank you. Yes, Sarah.
So from a practical point of view, commission the most challenging consultations we have, particularly at the moment when obesity is one of the highest risk factors for cancer. So are there any, how do we address sort of when the patient says to us, so I don't intend to pay very little, how can we, have you got any tips as to how we might be able to address that with patients?
Yeah. So the question is, I'm just repeating for the sake of those online, the question is about how you actually deal with patients who say to you, I'm really not eating much, and do I have any tips? Which I really don't, I'm sorry, and I'm going to say something that I should have said at the beginning, that I had to clarify for Paul. I'm not a clinician. I have the luxury of being a lab scientist, working in a clinical environment, so I don't have to deal with this. And I just think it is very difficult. And I don't know. I mean, you can't immediately offer them a measure of energy expenditure, which might be very good. John Garrow certainly had techniques like that. And he would get people to write down what they eat. And then he would bring them in. He had a metabolic lab where he could do this, you know, and feed them what they said they ate. And of course, they'd lose weight. But, you know, you haven't got time to do that in clinical practice, I'm quite sure. So I just think it is very difficult, but I do think the evidence would be solidly behind you if you were to say, look, there must be things you've forgotten to write down or you've missed. The evidence would be solidly backing you up on that.
Yeah, you would tend to you'll underestimate what you actually think you're eating by nature. Maybe that's the best advice. So the diaries are no good then, are they not? Food diaries for people to force them to see their calories.
Sorry, so I mean, I've worked a lot with dietitians and nutritionists, and the food diary can be a very useful tool because it will tell you, for instance, where that person is getting most of their fat, for instance, and then you can help them work to cut down fat, for instance, if that's what you think is appropriate. So the food diary is an important tool, but it shouldn't be used in a quantitative sense.
But do you think if they're doing a food diary, under reporting, which was sort of one of the messages that you were saying, I sometimes look at the food diaries I do after, and I think that under reporting.
So this is, I'm just repeating again, for the sake of this online, the question is, you know, well, how about food diaries and what can we really read into them? But a lot of people would like to believe that although we know there's underreporting, that it's not selective underreporting and that the proportions of fat, carbohydrate, protein, and so on are still reasonably reflected. There's not good evidence for that, but it's what a lot of people would like to believe. And I think that's the best I can say. So if you see somebody's eating a lot of pizza, you know, and that's contributed a lot to their fat intake, that might be something you could focus on. But it is awfully difficult. I'm fully behind that.
I think Matt did have a question.
Yeah, we could. It's about how much of that reporting is conscious.
Yeah.
How much of it is unconscious.
Yeah.
Because we see the same with nephrologists, so it's the same thing in
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
Teaspoon a day.
Yeah.
And we see it with drug intake.
Yeah.
The same kind of patient. So, and I never understand how much of it's conscious, how much of it's unconscious, how
Yeah.
much of it's self-functioning perception. Just with a few from the literature.
The question is how much of the underreporting is conscious and how much is rationalization and so on. Excuse me. So I've written a bit about this in the book from experience of filling in food diaries myself, which is a very good thing to do. And so the first thing I think is the problem that the food diary, it's like, I've called it the nutritional uncertainty principle. You try and measure it and it affects what you're doing. You know, because if I've got to fill in a food diary that one of my students is going to read, I think, well, perhaps I won't take that. You know, that glass of wine can sit on the shelf for a bit. You know, so it can affect. I mean, so that's one problem. But the fact that, and it's absolutely solid when I say that the heavier somebody is, the bigger somebody is, the more they tend to underreport. I mean, there's so much literature on that, and there's no blame in saying that. You know, it's a fact, and we have to work out why. And my best interpretation is that actually it's part of the condition that leads to obesity, that people are not really appreciating what they're eating to the extent that they're not even recording it. But we don't really have good data on that. I'm just, as a little anecdote from what you were saying, I'm remembering there's a little episode in one of the Inspector Morse books by Colin Dexter, and it's based on his own experience as a patient, because his diabetes was treated by a very good colleague of mine, David Matthews. And David Matthews appears in one of the books as a sort of tall figure who comes up to the patient, which is Colin Dexter, in disguise, and asks him his alcohol intake. And so Colin Dexter, the patient, immediately divides it by 3 and reports that. And the physician immediately multiplies it by 3. He says, oh yeah. But no, I don't think we have a good answer. But I don't think a lot of it, I don't think can be deliberate because it's so consistent.
Research project there. We've got lots of questions here, but we've got plenty of time, which is not 8:30 yet. So I'm going to go to Keith first. Yeah.
I used to find them, not my patients, invisible calories. They were unaware of what they were eating.
Yeah.
And I remember one very large lady, and I said, well, what do you eat? What do you eat that you shouldn't eat? She says, well, I occasionally have a Mars bar. I said, define occasionally. And she said, I have it every day. Middle of it. I said, that isn't occasion, that's regular. Well, it turned out that because they didn't have a very high income, she couldn't understand the idea of waste. So if any of the children, and she had 5 or 6, left any food, she'd eat it.
Yeah.
But she didn't regard that as part of her diet.
Yeah. So the question is about how people see what they're eating and whether they're not really taking account of everything, like eating somebody else's leftovers, or how regularly they might eat a Mars bar. And I think what you've put your finger on is probably very true, that they're not seeing that as part of what they're eating. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. So in another of my books, I've put quite a lot about the history of studies on starvation. And I don't know if any of you would know the work of George Cahill and his colleagues in Boston. They treated obese patients by bringing them into hospital and starving them. You know, therapeutic starvation it was called. And of course, they lost weight. But they were also the volunteers in that they were, in effect, volunteers for some wonderful metabolic studies of what happens in starvation. And a lot of what we know comes from those patients. But Oliver Owen, who was working with George Cahill, writes about this. And he writes about some of this earlier studies. And he said they called it starvation, but actually the patient might say, oh, I need a Coca-Cola now. You know, they just have a Coca-Cola. And so it's this sort of thing that wasn't counted as energy intake because it wasn't part of a formal meal. So, you know, snacking may be part of this. I don't think we really know.
Thank you. Broken biscuits have no calories.
Oh, yeah. White chocolate, I know.
Yeah.
We don't have ability to regulate ourselves. In all sorts of public health things have been tried over the years. Exercise prescription was
Yeah.
pushed as a general practice.
Yeah.
Most patients never
Yeah.
completed their 10
Yeah.
seconds.
Yeah.
We did, very few actually continued. Likewise with eating and drinking. And drug addicts who didn't stop taking drugs despite what we dealt with.
Yeah.
And so I switched it with them. And I remember talking to them, why did you stop? What was you stupid, didn't it? For some reason they decided to stop. Realizing that the large obese patients unnecessary. Why did you suddenly lose 4 stone weight? I couldn't change the drug show and I'm going one day. So is actually all of this a good reason to put forward that we should go back to rationing? To the market commercialisation of food sectors.
Yeah. So that how can I summarize that? The question is about whether there's something that suddenly triggers somebody to recognize that they have to cut down their intake or continue their exercise, and whether rationing is the answer. And maybe I wouldn't have ever promoted that, but in the last chapter in my book, I do look at how things have changed and what we might need to do. But of course, that was really, it's all been superseded a bit by the weight loss drugs, the GLP-1 agonists. There's, I don't know what anyone, I'd be interested to know what people feel about that. Yeah. No, absolutely. And so there is a very strong argument, I think, that the food companies have been making billions, by feeding us junk, ultra processed food full of calories. And now the drug companies are going to make billions treating it. So there's something wrong with that model for sure. Oh. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm asking for a friend. The lean body mass, like saving resistance. Will their fat, their weight of fat go up, down, or stay the same?
Yeah. So the question is, if you increase your lean body mass by, say, weight training, what happens to your fat mass? There's no reason at all why that would follow. If you change your fat mass, lean body mass has to follow, because I think this isn't muscle mass. It's sort of this tissue that supports the fat, including even the cytoplasm of adipocytes, which would count as lean body mass, oddly. So I think if you build up your muscles, there's no reason to think at all that fat will go with that. There's no reason at all why you couldn't change the relative proportions of muscle and fat by weight training. And that will increase your resting energy expenditure, definitely. I mean, without doubt.
So would your fat mass in that case go down?
Well, definitely it could. It could, yeah. Yeah, it could. Yeah.
Let's hope.
So, okay. So there is, I've got a whole chapter on physical activity in the book, because I think it's very underestimated, because, well, Robert Lustig, again, in that video says there's no point in exercising because you got to run for 20 minutes to equal 1 chocolate chip cookie, and I think it's so illogical, because 1 chocolate chip cookie isn't going to make you fat. But what we need to think about is if you eat one every day, or if you exercise every day for 20 minutes, they're going to balance each other out. And I think we have to think in a much broader way about exercise. And the other thing that, if I may just say this, I reviewed a lot the work on exercise, because there's no doubt if somebody has to lose weight for medical reasons or for any other reason they want to, exercise doesn't help as much as you'd expect. The only thing to do that is restricting the calories. But when you look at people who've lost weight and then kept it off, a very, very universal feature is they've increased the amount of physical activity they do. And I think it's more than the calories. It somehow changes the relationship with food, physical activity. So I think it's very important.
Good. Keep advising people. Yes.
I agree very much with what you just said there, because I recently changed done with that, and I find I'm a lot less hungry doing more exercise. The more exercise I do, that is better.
Yeah.
But I also wonder if obviously there is a lot of debate about Christmas foods, and also the debate where before we originally, everybody was told to eat a lot less fat, and then they ended up eating a lot of fat. And the food industry incorporated this carbohydrate, like fat foods. And I wonder if you feel that that has definitely contributed to the obesity crisis, and whether there is there's somehow something different about metabolism in fats compared with the carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And the other question I have is whether you feel that the brain is actually capable of calculating the kind of nutrients that somebody has, and therefore if you're getting the correct nutrients that are good for a healthy body and life, but if you're not getting them, that you're still hungry and still want more food, because that's one of the kind of things that's been put forward recently.
Yeah.
So
Because there are two questions there, and yeah.
Okay, well, I can sort of roll them in, because the question is about, are all nutrients like fat and carbohydrates similarly fattening, or do they have different metabolic effects? And does the body have a way of sensing that it needs a particular nutrient? And there is a very interesting body of study, but mainly done in, well, smaller animals, including insects, that says that we want to eat a certain amount of protein, and therefore we'll eat whatever else comes with the protein until we get that amount of protein. So if you're eating a food that's fairly low in protein, you'll overconsume calories in order to get that amount of protein. The evidence for that operating in humans is really not very strong. And I mean, in a way, the title of this book is summarizing the fact that I think that actually, whether you get your calories from carbohydrate or fat or protein, they're calories. And that's the overriding feature. I wouldn't be held to that completely. You know, I think protein in particular has some interesting features. It's very good at satiating, so it helps you reduce the time before you next eat. It also, of the three major nutrients, has the biggest, well, has the thing has various names, but postprandial thermogenesis. So when we eat something, there's always a little period when our energy expenditure goes up as we digest it, store it away. And protein has the biggest effect, but it's not a big effect. But, you know, there are reasons why protein perhaps is a good thing to aim for in terms of calories. No point in over-consuming protein as is now a trend because you think it's going to make you healthy. You know, it won't. You'll probably just pee most of it down the drain.
Yeah, I'm just going to take one more question, and Joe, maybe you could ask at the end, because I feel that we're going to get towards the end shortly, but the crumble is waiting. So, yes,
but how you would first see in a study saying how hard it was when you wanted to lose a certain kilo, and obviously people who are overweight say how much. I just wonder if we should focus more on, as a society, how to prevent that in the first place.
Yes.
You know, like sometimes I see young children and they're really overweight, and I'm really scared about that because, as I understand it, they're always going to struggle. Whereas if you spend more on educating parents of young children and babies, because I'm always seeing parents like giving their kids ice cream and all that stuff, and they want to give. It's just whether we should focus on the prevention or.
Yeah. So the question, if I may summarize it like this, is, well, shouldn't we be focusing more on prevention than treatment? And of course, I completely agree. And that's, you know, it's a public health issue in a way, but it's broader than that. You know, the government's record on strategies to tackle obesity, and all governments actually, is just atrocious. You know, and there have been lots of targets that have never been met or unfocused strategies. And I think it has to come from government. Education must be part of it. There's a socio-economic issue here that poorer families where the education isn't so good will eat less good food, and also partly because it's seen as cheaper. I'm not convinced it always is cheaper, but it's seen as cheaper and it's more readily available. So there's lots of issues. And I think, I mean, in that case, there's got to be a top-down approach. And I would fully back you in saying education must be part of that.
Especially parents. I just think
Yeah.
you got all these booklets from the doctor about being pregnant.
Yes.
If you target that education in GP, so saying how important it is to keep the child healthy diet.
Yes, yes. So the question again is about, can we target the parents of children? And I agree. I mean, there's a very strong tracking of obesity from childhood into adulthood, and it is awful, isn't it, to see the number of overweight youngsters around. Whether giving them booklets helps, I don't know. I don't know how it's to be done.
10% of school children are now overweight, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for tonight's talk, which has really been consumed by the audience avidly. To go over. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There's so much to talk about, isn't there? We'll be so heavily stimulated by a very rich intellectual meal. My solution, I was interested in David's comments about rationing. I think what you need is very narrow aisles in Sainsbury's if it's the cake bit, and then wider aisles in the vegetable bit. And that would work perfectly right. The hors d'oeuvres were interesting. Physics, it's very good to return to physics, and it's really weird, isn't it, to think that when you lose weight, you breathe it out, and that's it. It doesn't go anywhere else. You've just got to keep breathing. And it's very nice to sort of we don't often hear about first law of thermodynamics in the reporting issue. I mean, we all know we deceive ourselves all the time with our reporting. It's interesting how there's been any debate about how rubbish reporting is, because we report ourselves wrongly to ourselves, and I report my intake wrongly to my wife and won't acknowledge that the biscuits went down spontaneously, and it definitely wasn't me in our two-person household. It's wonderful also to hear about the energy balance, really. I'm so relieved to hear that something that I learned at medical school is still correct, because I spent every day talking about hormones that seem to have evolved since 1998, or antibody tests that never existed in Newcastle. So the one thing that I did learn as a medical student was this, and then I read all Gary Towns and Dr. Lustig's books and thought, gosh, I'm so wrong, and now I'm so relieved to have that balance redressed. It's been a wonderful talk. We've all been very stimulated. There's lots more to talk about, and I guess what we embody is the difference between behaviour and physics, and perhaps it's useful for us as behaviouralists. I learned this week that there are GLP-1 receptors on the choroid plexus, which as a neurologist is a slightly interesting bit of anatomy, but it might be interesting, right? It's bizarre. Why? And then I was thinking about my patients with idiopathic intracranial hypertension. But anyway, it's lovely for us behaviouralists to be reminded of the science. And thank you very much. It's been a wonderful talk, and on a dreary, horrible day, I think the audience demonstrate the interest in both the quality of the speaker and the subject matter. So thank you very much.